Flames licked the Hercules' pockmarked wing as Mara Langley's gloved fingers danced over the throttles, coaxing the ancient airframe into one final desperate surge. Even in this moment, her heart hammered not with fear, but with the quiet satisfaction of control. Drapa, if you've ever been underestimated. She worked here Deckhaven training compound for 10 months, the lone woman in a sea of grizzled mechanics and ex-combat pilots. Every dawn, she wiped sweat and grease from her slender arms, tuned the archaic engines, and calibrated avionics until they hummed like newborn hummingbirds. Few noticed her. Fewer still suspected that her calm touch masked extraordinary skill. Her father's voice hovered at the edge of memory. Precision, Mara, always precision. He'd been a celebrated sniper, cold, patient, unerring before the fractures in his mind ended his career. And her mother, the elite field medic whose steady hands had saved scores of lives at Kandahar, had taught her to find grace in urgency. This morning had begun like any other. Her boots thudded across oil-stained concrete, the morning fog curling around hangars. She checked tire pressures, patched the tiny fissure in a hydraulic line, and replaced frayed wiring in the cockpit panel. A dozen men lounged nearby, sipping bitter coffee, cracking jokes about the decrepit bird she called home. Bet it bites the dust before noon, one laughed. Mara only smiled. Then the call came. A Category 5 cyclone was barreling inland, smashing through villages faster than predicted. Local command wanted evac and relief teams airborne within the hour. Her supervisor frowned at the radio. Their only heavy lift asset was this Relicacy 130 Hercules built decades ago, its logbook thicker than its metal. "We need pilot sign-off," he muttered. No one volunteered. Mara stepped forward. Silence fell. In that pause, every eye fixed on her dark blue uniform, pristine, tailor-fitted, almost soulful in its stillness. She felt the weight of their doubt. "Comment, if you believe in hidden strengths." "Captain Langley," her supervisor said, surprise sharpening his tone. "This isn't your specialty." "It is today," she replied. She climbed into the cockpit, slid into the worn leather seat, and ran a hand over the yoke. Inside her mind, emergency drills and approach charts revolved like satellites. Crosswind calculations, payload distributions, engine torque curves. She breathed deep, letting the aircraft's rumble sync with her own pulse. The ground crew gave her the signal. She nodded. At full throttle, the Hercules shuddered free of concrete, climbing into a sky already choked with dark clouds. She guided it toward the eye of the storm, flares from villages below flickering like dying embers. A sudden jolt. One engine spluttered, warning lights blinking in protest. Systems overloaded. The crew TENCD. Without thinking, Mara keyed her. "Mike, switching fuel manifolds to bypass. Hold her steady." Her voice was calm command. She reached for the alternate hydraulic pump switch. Her fingers moved as if rehearsed 1,000 times. The engine coughed, then resumed its roar. Relief crackled through the cabin. In the mirror, she caught the astonished faces of her crew. Their doubt dissolved into awe. She flew low, the wind tearing at the wings, and dropped relief pallets onto a flooded village. Each crate hit its target with surgical precision. A shudder of cheers rippled behind her, touching down at the compound. Engines coasting, she fought the tremor in her limbs, not from fear, but from the surge of purpose fulfilled. Mechanics and pilots spilled onto the tarmac, surrounding the ancient bird as if it were a war hero. Mara slid from the cockpit. Sunlight broke through roiling clouds, glinting on her midnight hair. She looked at the battered Hercules and quietly felt at home. Resolution settled in her chest. She had proven something today, something she'd carried since childhood. Legacy isn't just inheritance. It's what you earn under fire. A dry wind rustled through the hangar. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, promising more trials to come. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, Please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The compound didn't sleep that night. The wind howled like an angry god, battering the rusted hangar doors. Inside, Mara Langley sat cross-legged on the Hercules' wing, oil rag in hand, wiping soot and salt from the battered metal. Her hair was tied in a loose braid that brushed against her coveralls. Around her, the other mechanics moved like shadows, their laughter muted, eyes darting to her when they thought she wouldn't notice. No one questioned her anymore. Not after what she'd done. The control tower crackled with frantic chatter, weather updates, rerouted supply chains, calls for more pilots. But there were no more pilots who could fly this old beast like she could. She traced her thumb over a hairline crack in the fuselage, feeling the Hercules' bones like a medic feeling for a pulse. Her father's words flickered in her mind. Again, precision, Mara, always precision. She could almost hear the calm cadence of his breathing, the way he'd guide her small hands as she learned to disassemble a rifle at age 9. The memory made her smile, but only for a second. She forced it away. Memories were dangerous distractions up here. Behind her, Private Lasco cleared his throat. He was young, too young to be this gaunt-eyed and sleep-deprived. Captain Langley? Command wants you in ops. She slid from the wing with feline grace, boots landing soundlessly on the concrete. The other mechanics stepped back to let her pass. They had learned something new about Mara Langley tonight. She didn't just mend metal. She commanded it. Inside the ops center, a ring of tired faces greeted her. Screens glowed with radar sweeps, satellite images, and storm models that looked like angry paint splatters. Major Rourke, the compound's commander, leaned over a table strewn with maps. He didn't look up as Mara approached. Sitrup? She asked, voice low but steady. Rourke lifted bloodshot eyes to hers. Cyclone changed track. More villages cut off. Medical supplies needed at Grid 85 Delta, and he hesitated, tapping a shaky finger on a blinking blip on the screen. One of our recon birds went down. 2 crew, injured, trapped near the river delta. Mara's mind worked faster than the weather models on the screen. Grid 85 Delta was just within reach. But the Hercules was limping on a half-patched engine, and her crew hadn't slept in 20 hours. Anyone else up for it? She asked. Silence answered. She felt a slow fire build in her chest, like a spark catching dry tinder. They'd called her aircraft ancient. They'd called her reckless for even trying. But now they needed the impossible. And the impossible was her domain. I'll do it, she said. Rourke's brow furrowed. Langley, you're exhausted. You need, I will do it. Her tone left no room for argument. Outside, the storm had become a living thing. Rain lashed sideways. Wind threatened to rip doors off hinges. Mara stepped onto the tarmac, the wind snapping her flight suit against her slender frame. She barked orders to the crew. Refuel, rearm, double-check every seal, every wire. They obeyed without question now. She moved through the preparations, like a maestro conducting an orchestra. Her fingers traced every rivet. Her eyes caught every loose bolt. She wasn't just flying a machine, she was becoming a dot inside the cockpit. She strapped in. The co-pilot, Ramirez, glanced at her with a mix of dread and admiration. Ready? She asked. Ramirez swallowed hard. As I'll ever be. She gave him a ghost of a smile. Good, let's bring them home. The Hercules lurched forward, engines straining against the storm's fury. Mara's grip on the yoke was steady, her knuckles pale. Instruments flickered as crosswinds buffeted the bird, but she felt each tremor like a heartbeat, adjusting trim and throttle by instinct alone. Radio crackled. Captain Langley, visibility near 0. You sure you want to? She cut them off. Negative chatter. We're committed. They climbed into a black sky roiling with thunderheads. Sheets of rain smashed against the windshield, wipers screaming in protest. Ramirez muttered prayers under his breath. Mara's thoughts were a metronome of calculations: distance, wind speed, fuel burn, Payload wake. Drop A. If you know what it means to trust yourself when no one else will. Lightning forked in the distance. The village drop came first. She banked hard to avoid a rogue squall, dropped altitude to clear a ridge, and leveled out above the village. Ramirez's hands hovered over the release switch. Now, she said. Crates tumbled out the bay doors, parachutes blossoming in the gale. They hit within meters of the target, a muddy clearing where villagers would find food and medicine waiting when the storm passed. But there was no time to celebrate. She swung the Hercules west, skimming treetops toward the river delta. Her eyes flicked to the fuel gauge redlining. Ramirez, talk to me, she barked. Recon beacons still pinging, but they're surrounded by floodwaters. We'll have to hover, drop, or raft if we don't overshoot. Mara's jaw tightened. The Hercules wasn't built for pinpoint extractions, but she had spent years tweaking its guts, recalibrating loadout systems, balancing its ancient wings. She had made it hers. Below, the river swelled, angry and brown, gnawing at its banks. Through breaks in the clouds, she spotted the tiny flare, a desperate spark in the darkness. Visual, she confirmed. She dropped flaps, throttled back, let the old bird settle into a crawl just above stall speed. Ramirez wrestled with the cargo netting as Mara guided them directly over the beacon. She counted out the seconds in her mind. 5, 4, 3, drop. The raft plunged into the floodwaters, its bright canopy bursting open. Two figures scrambled toward it, one limping badly. Got them, Ramirez shouted. Mara didn't smile, not yet. She coaxed the Hercules back into the storm's teeth, eyes darting to the fuel gauge again. It dipped below reserve. The return flight was a blur of turbulence and hydraulic groans. She whispered to the aircraft, as she always did, hold together. Just a little longer. They slammed onto the runway at Deckhaven just before dawn, metal shrieking, brakes smoking. The moment the wheels kissed concrete, the Hercules' right engine coughed its last, sputtering into silence. When they opened the bay doors, rescue teams were already waiting, pulling the soaked recon crew to safety. Mara slid down the cargo ramp, her boots splashing into puddles that mirrored the breaking dawn. Around her, men and women clapped her on the back, voices raised in ragged cheer. Ramirez stood beside her, trembling with relief. She looked back at the battered Hercules, her ancient, defiant partner. She reached out and laid a hand on its flank, feeling the warmth of the metal beneath the rain. Her father's words drifted back once more. Precision. Always precision. But now she heard her mother's voice, too. Courage is what you do when the odds laugh in your face. In that moment, Mara knew she had crossed a line one she could never uncross. She had become the thing they all depended on. And the weight of that truth pressed against her ribs like an iron heartbeat. The storm had passed. But somewhere in the vast sky beyond, darker clouds gathered. Comment, if you know the calm is never truly calm. She turned back toward Ops, boots squelching. Through puddles, shoulders squared for whatever came next. Dawn bled into a bruised sky as Mara Langley stepped out of the hangar. The tarmac shimmered with fresh puddles, and the wind smelled of diesel and wet concrete. She could still hear the Hercules cooling behind her, metal ticking as it shed the night's fury. She rolled her shoulders, fighting the ache that had settled deep into her bones. She'd only managed an hour of sleep on a cot in the break room, boots still on, flight suit half zipped. But there was no time to rest when a storm left this much broken in its wake. She found herself back in the maintenance bay, crouched beside a half-dismantled hydraulic pump. Her slender fingers worked with surgical precision, tracing hoses and seals, tightening bolts the others missed. Around her, the mechanics gave her space now unspoken respect, radiating in every nod. In the corner, Ramirez leaned against a toolbox, eyes bloodshot, a steaming mug cradled in his hands. He watched her like a man watching a miracle he didn't quite believe in yet. "You know you should be asleep," he said, voice hoarse. Mara didn't look up. I will, after this is done. You always say that. She allowed herself the ghost of a smile. And I always mean it. Beyond the open hangar doors, supply trucks rumbled in and out. Helicopters lifted off in slow waves, ferrying crates of food and medicine to villages still cut off by landslides. A radio perched on. A nearby workbench crackled with constant chattercal signs, grid coordinates, status updates. Each voice carried an undercurrent of desperation. The cyclone had broken power lines and bridges for miles. The compound was now the beating heart of survival. Mara's mind never stopped spinning. Even as she twisted a wrench, she ran mental. Checklists, fuel reserves, spare parts inventory, flight rosters. She was the hub around which the chaos turned. And they all knew it now. Drop a, if you've ever carried more than anyone realized. A sudden voice cut through her thoughts. Major Rourke, striding in with boots caked in mud, eyebrows drawn tight. He held a folder in one hand, its edges curling from the humidity. Langley, debrief, now. She wiped her hands on a rag, rose to her full height slender, but with a quiet power in her posture. Rourke led her to a battered metal desk at the far end of the hangar. He dropped the folder with a thud. Satellite images spilled out photos of a landslide the size of a city block. A convoy got buried, he said flatly. Medical staff, civilians they were evacuating. It's bad. The only way in is by air, but there's no place to land. We need precision drops food, water, trauma kits. Then maybe we can chopper some of them out once the ground teams dig a path. Mara flipped through the photos. Her eyes darted from the collapsed road to the grid coordinates, her mind overlaying wind vectors and flight paths she'd memorized. During endless nights at her battered desk, "You want the Hercules," she said. Rourke didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew she was the only one who could thread an ancient beast like that through a mountain pass barely wide enough for daylight. She felt the familiar burn in her chest, equal parts fear and resolve. Every flight now was a risk. But she was built for risks. Or maybe she'd been forged by them. "Give me Ramirez and Private Lasco on the drop crew," she said. "I want Jenkins on comms. And tell engineering I need that port engine's oil line resealed within an hour." Rourke nodded, the faintest glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. "One more thing," he said, his voice softer now. "They're not just counting on the supplies. They're counting on you." She felt that weight settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. But she welcomed it. Responsibility gave her clarity. Doubt was a luxury for people who could afford to fail. She walked back to the Hercules, its scarred fuselage reflecting the pale dawn light. She climbed the ladder, slipping into the cockpit where she could hear the creak and groan of age in every rivet. Her fingers brushed the controls with the intimacy of an old friend. Her father's voice came to her, then precision. Her mother's voice layered over it, courage. And then her own voice, quiet but unyielding, commitment. She ran. Through the pre-flight like a ritual. Fuel pumps check, hydraulics check. Avionics temperamental but serviceable. Every flick of a switch was a promise kept. Ramirez climbed in behind her, his steps slow from exhaustion. He dropped into the co-pilot's seat with a grunt. "Back at it," he said. "Back at it," she echoed. The engines whined to life, one after the other, coughing smoke that drifted into the gray sky. Mara felt the vibrations through her bones, an old heartbeat syncing with her own. They taxied out, the compound growing smaller behind them. She glanced at the faces in the back, young men and women who would rappel into mud and ruin to haul out survivors. They trusted her to get them there, to get them home. A voice crackled over the headset. "Langley, you're clear. Weather's moving in fast. You'll have maybe one window in or out." She pressed the transmit switch. "That's all I need." The Hercules clawed into the air, its wings flexing against the buffeting winds. Mara's eyes never left the horizon. though she felt the storm in every shudder of metal around her. The mountain pass loomed ahead, a narrow vein between jagged teeth of rock. Altitude steady, Ramirez reported. Trim left 2 degrees, she said, fingers dancing over the yoke dot below. The landslide spread like an ugly scar across the green earth. She could see the tiny flashes of reflective vests, people trapped in mud, waving tarps at the rumble of engines overhead. She lowered flaps, bled speed. The old Hercules fought her every inch of the way, but she whispered to it, "Hold. Just hold." The cargo bay doors yawned open. Lasco and Jenkins manned the release rig, bracing against the wind that howled through the hold. "Mark it," Mara called. Lasco's voice crackled back, "On your go." She banked hard, aligning the drop. Zone with a surgeon's precision. The trees scraped so close she could almost count the leaves. 3, 2, drop. Crates tumbled into the void, parachutes unfurling like pale flowers in the wind. They hit the slope just shy of the buried convoy, skidding into place exactly where the rescuers could reach them. A roar of relief went up in her headset. "Dead on, Langley. They're moving the first survivors now." Ramirez exhaled so hard it fogged the windshield. Mara allowed herself one heartbeat of pride, then it was gone. They weren't done yet. She angled the Hercules back into the pass, fighting downdrafts that wanted to rip the wings off. The engines rattled like old bones. "Hold," she whispered again. "Just hold. Drop if you've ever pushed through when every part of you said stop." When they finally broke through the clouds on the other side, the valley spread out below them, lush and impossibly green under the first rays of sunlight. Mara let out a slow breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Ramirez turned to her, eyes wide with the realization that what they'd done wasn't just luck. It was mastery. "You scare the hell out of me, Captain," he said, voice almost a laugh. Mara smiled, a real one this time. "Good, keeps you awake." They touched down an hour later, wheels kissing concrete so gently you'd think the Hercules was young again. Mechanics swarmed the plane, chatter buzzing in the dawnlight. Mara lingered in the cockpit for a moment, hand resting on the yoke. This bird, this crew, this compound, they were hers now, in a way that no metal or title could ever explain. Somewhere out there, the next storm gathered, and she would be ready. Comment if you know that being ready is a choice you make every single day. The compound buzzed like a hive that wouldn't rest. Hours after Mara Langley and her battered Hercules returned from the mountain pass, the hangar was a battlefield of welding sparks and shouted orders. The storm had tested every rivet, every tired piston rod, every soul that touched that ancient aircraft. But the real storm, the one brewing in whispers and side eyes, had just begun. Mara stood at the foot of the Hercules' open bay door, grease smeared on her sleeve, an old schematic spread across a rolling metal cart. Her eyes flicked over torque specs and fuel line pressure tolerances like she was reading an old poem. Beside her, Lasco readjusted a bandage on his forearm. He'd caught shrapnel when a supply crate had kicked loose mid-drop. He said nothing. He didn't have to. His presence at her side was loyalty enough. "Langley!" Major Rourke's bark cut through the clang of the hangar. He marched toward her, folder in hand, a deep crease between his eyes that hadn't been there the week before. She wiped her hands on a rag but didn't move to stand straighter. She'd earned the right to meet him on her terms now. Rourke stopped a few feet away, his boots leaving dirty water prints on the oil-stained concrete. He flipped the folder open, revealing photos a downed transport chopper half submerged in swamp mud, its tail twisted like a broken arm. Next to it, thermal scans. Human silhouettes, huddled under the fuselage. "UN medevac went down," he said. "Mechanical failure medevac. They've got wounded on board, out of radio range except for this transponder. Local militia moving in. If they get there first." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Mara reached for the photo, her finger tracing the outline of the wreck. Swamp country. Limited clearance, no runways. Not even a dirt strip wide enough for the Hercules to belly in. She didn't look at Rourke when she spoke. You want a hover drop or a low rope insertion? You tell me. She folded the photo and tucked it in her chest pocket. Load the medics with harnesses. If they can't walk, we lift them on stretchers. And I want the old cargo winch. Read by nightfall. I'm not risking a manual pull. Rourke's eyes narrowed, the flicker of a smile ghosting his lips. You know this is insane. She finally looked up, eyes dark and steady. Then we'll fit right in. Behind her, the maintenance crew paused their work for a heartbeat, just long enough to share a glance that said everything. They'd follow her anywhere now. Even into a swamp crawling with hostiles. Drop a, if you've ever been the one they call when the worst happens. Night bled across the compound, washing the hangar in bruised shadows and rattling wind. Inside the Hercules, Mara's boots echoed on the cargo bay deck. She checked the cables twice, then a third time. Ramirez joined her at the ramp, arms crossed, fatigue etched in every line on his face. You know, they say you're cursed, he said lightly, gesturing at the patched bullet holes along the fuselage. Mara snorted. They also said this plane wouldn't fly again, or that I couldn't fly it. He shrugged, conceding the point. Fair. Still, you ever think about how you keep volunteering for the suicide runs? She pulled a frayed harness strap through her gloved fingers, inspecting it inch by inch. It's not about the runs, Ramirez. It's about the people waiting at the end of them. He looked at her, really looked at her, like he was trying to read the lines of a book written in a language he'd never dared learn. Finally he shook his head. You're something else, Captain. She gave him a small, tired smile. Good, keeps you awake. They lifted off under the blanket of a moonless sky. The Hercules' engines groaned against the wet air, propellers carving a path through low clouds that clung like ghosts the canopy below. Mara sat forward in her seat, headset pressed tight to her ear, eyes flitting between instruments and the black abyss outside. Her mother's words rose from memory like a heartbeat. The body will break before the will does. Below them, the swamp spread out like an oil spill, black water reflecting the glow of distant fires. Somewhere in that dark, people clung to life because they believed rescue would come. Because someone like Mara existed. The first warning came with a static burst. Across her comes. Langley, be advised local militia units move in toward the downed bird. Estimated 20 minutes out. She keyed the mic, calm as stone. Copy, we'll be out before they get there. Ramirez shot her a sidelong glance. And if we're not? She didn't answer. She didn't have to dot as they neared the crash. Sight, the Hercules dropped lower, trees scraping past like jagged teeth. Mara's eyes narrowed, scanning for the thin wisp of smoke she'd marked in the photos. There a break in the canopy, a glint of twisted metal half sunk in the marsh. Ramirez. Rig the winch. Lasco on the harness. We're going in tight. The cargo ramp yawned open, sucking warm swamp air into the fuselage. The winch cable slithered out, swaying like a snake in the downdraft. Lasco clipped in, his face pale under the cabin lights. You ever done this? He asked, half joking. Mara's voice was steady thunder. Just don't look down. She feathered. The throttles holding the Hercules in a fragile hover just above the tree line. The old airframe shuddered, protesting the unnatural posture. Below, Lasco dropped through the green dark canopy, boots splashing in knee-high water as he reached the wounded. Minutes dragged like hours. Ramirez barked updates, eyes darting between the open bay and the thermal scope. 2 on the line. Winch. Pulling steady, Mara's hands were steel on the yoke. Every muscle coiled to fight the crosswind that wanted to spin them like a leaf. She ignored the flickering fuel light. Ignored the warning beeps that said they were burning precious. Reserves by the second. A voice in her ear, Lasco's, hoarse with strain. "Last one coming up." She risked a glance back. A medic dangled in the air, clutching a stretcher strapped to the winch cable. Mud dripped onto the cargo deck as Ramirez and another crewman hauled the survivor in by hand. Then, a crackle of gunfire below. Muzzle flashes. Like fireflies among the trees. "Go! Go! Go!" Ramirez shouted. Mara slammed the throttles forward. The Hercules lurched ahead, winch cable whipping as Lasco scrambled to reel it back in. Rounds thudded into the tail, sparks flying as metal screamed in protest. She kept her eyes forward, willing the old bird to hold together. "Just a little longer," she whispered to it. Just a little longer. They burst through the canopy engines, roaring defiance into the night. Behind them, the swamp faded into shadow and silence. When they touched down at Deckhaven, dawn was just a smear of purple on the horizon. Medics swarmed the survivors, hauling them off stretchers and into waiting. Ambulances. Mara sat alone in the cockpit for a moment, headset dangling around her neck, heartbeat pounding in her ears. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass grease-smudged face, hair plastered to her forehead, eyes so bright they seemed to burn, drop. If you know what it feels like to become what everyone else thought you couldn't be." She unclipped her harness, stepped out into the chill dawn, and met the crew that had become her shadow. They were battered, bloodied, half broken by fatigue, but they were alive. And so were the people waiting in that swamp. Major Rourke stood at the edge of the tarmac, watching her approach with an expression caught between disbelief and relief. "You're pushing your luck, Langley," he said. She met his eyes. "Luck has nothing to do with it." He held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, then nodded. "Get some rest. We're not done yet." She knew he was right. She knew the next mission would come. The next storm. The next broken piece of sky that only she could fly through, and she would be ready. The compound had a heartbeat now, steady, relentless, unstoppable. Mara Langley could feel it under her boots as she crossed the hangar floor, a vibration that matched her own pulse. Every time the Hercules returned battered but not broken, every time a life was pulled from the jaws of a storm or a war zone, that heartbeat grew stronger. So did the whispers. She'd heard them while she stood elbow-deep in engine oil, a rag slung over her shoulder. She's reckless. She flies that ancient tin can like she wants to die. She's not just a pilot, she's a ghost. She let them talk. She let the shadows gather around her name. She knew the truth. She was the last resort, the hidden blade no one saw coming until it was too late to doubt her. Tonight, the air was thick with heat, lightning, and the restless buzz of an impending storm. Mara moved between the Hercules' wings like a surgeon prepping an old patient for another miracle. Ramirez sat on an overturned crate nearby, flipping a battered coin between his fingers, his eyes tracking her movements. "Word is command wants to ground you for a cycle," he said. "Mandatory rest," she snorted. "You volunteering to fly her instead?" He paled visibly. The Hercules wasn't just a machine. It was an extension of Mara, an old soul that only obeyed one master. She wiped her hands on a rag, inspecting. "The landing gear hydraulics. They'll try to ground me." "But they won't." Ramirez tilted his head. "How do you figure?" She turned, eyes locked on his, unflinching. "Because I'm the only one who'll fly into places they won't. Even send drones. And we're not done yet." Drapa, if you've ever known rest was a luxury you couldn't afford. A shout echoed through the hangar. Private Lasco, breathless, carrying a sealed folder marked priority. Mara didn't wait for an explanation. She flipped it open on the Wing.Dot satellite photos. A string of small coastal villages shredded by a rogue tidal surge, hundreds stranded on rooftops, roads underwater. The local authority had one chopper, already out of fuel and half broken. Relief teams were trapped inland by washed-out roads. Rourke's scribbled note at the bottom: no airstrips. Only option, water drop or hover retrieval. High risk. Mara snapped. The folder shut. Prep the winch again. Ramirez, get Jenkins and Lasco kitted for water lift. We'll have to do pickups 2 at a time. Ramirez opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it. He just nodded. You think the old girl's got another one in her? Mara glanced back at the Hercules, its battered frame catching the hangar lights like a prizefighter's scarred face. She always does. She spent the next hour inspecting every bolt, every hydraulic line. Her mind slipped into that rare state where everything else faded, no past, no future, just the work, the hum of metal and memory. Precision, her father would say. Grace and urgency, her mother would remind her. By the time the crew was strapped in, and the Hercules roared too. Life, the compound's lights looked like distant stars on a black sea. Mara settled into the cockpit, headset snug over her ears, fingers dancing across switches with the reverence of a priest lighting candles. The wind outside gusted, hard enough to rattle the windows. Rain hammered the windshield in fat, angry drops. Ramirez checked the cargo bay, voice crackling through the intercom. Winch is primed, harnesses secured. We ready, Captain? She flexed her gloved hands on the yoke. We're ready. The Hercules clawed into the storm, engines screaming defiance. Mara's breath matched its rhythm. Every gust was a question, can you hold? And every adjustment of the throttle was her answer, yes. They flew low, hugging the coastline. Below, rooftops jutted out of the angry black water like tombstones. Flares blinked from attics where families had huddled for hours, hoping the sea would spare them. Ramirez marked the first pickup. Mara ordered. He scanned the floodplain with a handheld scope. North quadrant, blue flare. 4 bodies on the roof, no ladder. She banked the Hercules hard, wings groaning under the strain. The old bird skimmed so close to the water that wind spray splashed against the cargo ramp. Open her up, she said. The ramp lowered, rain and sea wind roaring. Through the hold. Lasco and Jenkins clipped in, their harness lines taut as they peered down into the swirling dark. One by one, they rappelled into the flood, fighting currents that tried to drag them under. Mara held the hover steady, every muscle in her back. And arms locked like steel cables. Minutes felt like lifetimes. Ramirez's voice was a constant metronome behind her. 2 on deck, 3rd inbound, his tone sharp, precise. He was learning her way now. The way of the impossible, the final survivor. A boy no older than 10 clung to Jenkins like a lifeline. They hoisted him into the hold, sodden and shivering, eyes wide as saucers when he saw Mara in the cockpit. She gave him a nod through the open hatch, a silent promise. You're safe now. They pulled back into the storm, engines at redline. The fuel gauge dipped alarmingly close to empty, but Mara didn't flinch. She coaxed every last breath out of those old turbines, threading the Hercules between squalls that could snap its wings like dry twigs. Drop a, if you've ever done what needed doing when every second told you to give up. When they finally touched down, dawn was an hour away. The rescued villagers were rushed into waiting trucks, blankets and warm drinks pressed into shaking hands. Ramirez and the others stumbled out, soaked to the bone, faces streaked with salt and rain. Mara sat in the cockpit alone for a long moment. Her eyes traced the rivets along the windshield, the streaks of condensation like veins. She reached out and rested her hand on the dashboard. Thank you, she whispered. To the Hercules, to the legacy that lived in her blood. To herself, outside, Rourke waited by the hangar door. He didn't say anything when she climbed down the ladder. He just gave her a look that held no more doubts, no more caution. You've done enough for tonight, he said. Sleep, we'll need you again. Mara only nodded. She knew sleep would be fleeting. The compound never truly rested. And neither did she. She crossed the tarmac toward the barracks, boots squelching through puddles, the rumble of the Hercules still echoing in her chest. The whispers would grow louder now. Hero, ghost, impossible. She let them swirl behind her like the storm clouds she'd flown through. In the morning, the old bird would need new parts. The crew would need new resolve. The people out there would need saving. And Mara Langley would be ready. Always ready. Drapa, if you know the weight of being someone's last hope. The sun barely broke the horizon when the compound came alive with the sound of engines coughing to life and boots sloshing through standing water. Mara Langley sat on an upturned crate beside the Hercules' nose wheel, black coffee steaming in a dented thermos clutched between grease-streaked hands. She hadn't changed out of her flight suit. There hadn't been time. There was never time. Around her, the crew moved with practiced chaos. Fuel lines snaked across the tarmac. Tool carts rattled under the push of mechanics shouting torque. Specks over the rumble of auxiliary power units. And through it all, Mara watched. Every detail fed into that mental map she carried. The one that made her the only pilot alive willing to bet her life on an aircraft that by rights should have been a museum piece. Ramirez dropped onto the crate beside her, close enough for their shoulders to touch. He was still damp from the night's rescue, hair slicked back, eyes bloodshot but alert. "You sleep at all?" he asked. Mara took a sip of coffee, eyes fixed on the Hercules' weathered fuselage. "Enough. Liar." He cracked a grin. But it faded when she didn't return it. A voice cut through the dawn. Major Rourke, striding across the hangar floor with a folder tucked under one arm. Even from 30 feet away, Mara could see the tension coiled in his shoulders. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He held out the folder, and Mara flipped it open without a word. Recon photos. A convoy of trucks stranded on a washed-out road in the mountains, boxed in by fresh rock slides on both sides. 23 people, including children. No ground access. Helicopters grounded by wind shear. And the worst part, supplies were nearly gone. Hypothermia would come for them before the storm relented. She closed the folder, handed it back. "When do we go?" Rourke rubbed the back of his neck. "Langley, I don't have to tell you, this is a straight shot through a wind tunnel. One bad downdraft, and you're a smear on a granite face." She just looked at him. That was answer. "Enough. Drapa, if you've ever stepped forward when everyone else stepped back, give me Jenkins and Lasco in the hold. Ramirez on comes. And triple-check the wing flaps. We lose a servo in those crosswinds, we're done." Rourke hesitated, but nodded. There was no one else for this. Hours later, the Hercules rumbled down the runway, engines straining as it clawed into the thin mountain air. Mara's hands were steady on the yoke, eyes flicking between instruments and the jagged teeth of granite. Rising to meet them, Ramirez's voice in her headset was a grounding force. "Winds at 60 knots, gusts unpredictable. Radar shows microbursts near the pass." Mara's voice was iron wrapped in silk. "We'll thread it." They hit the first wave of turbulence like a punch to the gut. The Hercules' frame shuddered. Cargo straps creaking, rivets groaning in protest. In the back, Lasco's muffled cursing cut through the coms. "Hold it steady back there." Mara barked. Lasco came back, breathless. "Copy, just rearranging my spine." She smiled, just a flicker. Humor was a survival tool, as necessary as fuel. They broke through a cloud bank, the valley opening below like a scar. Mara could see the stranded trucks, tiny toy models perched on a narrow switchback trail. She dropped flaps, bled speed, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to climb. The wind grabbed at the wings, tried to spin the Hercules like a leaf. "Ramirez, ready the drop," she said. He didn't answer, didn't need to. He'd learned by now when to trust her silence. Crates of thermal blankets, food rations, and emergency medical supplies sat strapped in the hold. Jenkins and Lasco worked the release rig, double-checking straps, counting beats with the sway of the aircraft. "Mark it." Mara snapped, "On your go." She watched the altimeter spin down 200 feet, 150, 100. any lower, and they'd risk clipping the trees that clung to the mountainside like barnacles. Now the cargo bay yawned open. Crates tumbled free, parachutes flaring. Mara banked hard, the Hercules skimming the ridgeline so close Ramirez flinched when a branch scraped the belly. Lasco whooped over the combs. Direct hit. Supplies landed within meters. Mara didn't let herself exhale yet. The worst was still ahead. As they climbed out of the pass, the wind slammed them broadside. The Hercules shuddered, dipped, and for a heartbeat, Mara felt the sickening lurch of a stall. She pushed the nose down, coaxed the engines to roar, willing the old bird to bite the air. Hold, she thought, teeth clenched. Just hold. They broke through at last, battered but whole. Ramirez's shaky laugh crackled in her ear. Remind me again why I signed up for this. Mara smiled, sweat dripping down her temple. Because you trust me. He couldn't argue. With that. Drop a they, if you've ever asked the impossible of yourself and delivered. When they landed back at Deckhaven, the compound buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Mechanics swarmed the Hercules, shouting over the whine of cooling engines. Rourke was waiting, arms crossed, eyes squinting against the prop wash. Mara climbed down, boots hitting the tarmac like hammer blows. Rourke didn't speak for a moment, just looked at the battered fuselage, then at her. You keep doing this, he said. They keep sending you because you never say no. She met his gaze, calm as ever. Would you? He shook his head. Not in your shoes, but then again, no one else could fill them. She didn't need praise. She didn't need medals. She needed the roar of engines and the moment right before the impossible happened, when her heart beat in time. With an old machine that trusted her as much as she trusted it, she walked back toward the hangar, boots echoing across the wet concrete. Behind her, the Hercules stood proud, a battered warhorse that would never stop proving the world wrong. In the shadows, men and women watched her go, some with awe, some with fear, all with the bone-deep knowledge that as long as Mara Langley and her ancient aircraft flew, there was hope. If you know, sometimes the oldest machines and the quietest souls carry us through the storm. The compound seemed to pulse in time with the low thunder of the Hercules' engines, even when they were silent. It had been 3 days since Mara Langley's last run, 3 days of uneasy calm that no one quite trusted. The hangar lights flickered. Against the pre-dawn haze, shadows stretching long over stacks of crates, and the patchwork, camouflage netting thrown over fuel barrels like a half-hearted disguise. Mara lay on her back under the Hercules' belly, a small flashlight clenched between her teeth, her fingertips tracing the vein of a fuel line that had started to sweat under pressure. Her world had narrowed to the smell of oil and the faint metallic taste of the air around her, a refuge from the low hum of rumors that crawled through the compound like static. She heard footsteps before she saw the boots' scuffed leather, laces half-tied. Ramirez crouched beside her, his silhouette outlined in the flashlight beam. You sleep yet? He asked. She didn't answer right away, didn't need to. The truth was a formality neither of them respected anymore. Rourke wants you in ops, Ramirez said. Something's come up. Mara slid out from under the plane, rolling her shoulders. The fatigue clung to her bones like a second skin. She wiped her hands on her flight suit and stood, stretching until her spine cracked back into place. Keep the left pump on standby, she said, nodding at the open panel. She bleed pressure if we don't monitor it in the climb. Ramirez just stared at her. You really think this bird's got another one in her? Mara gave him that quiet, unyielding smile. She outlasts us both. They crossed the tarmac in silence, the compound's heartbeat rising with the drone of distant engines. Ops was a war room carved from cold concrete and flickering screens. Radios buzzing with fractured voices. Major Rourke stood over a topographical map peppered with grease pencil marks. When Mara stepped in, the other officers fell silent, like someone had flipped a switch. Rourke didn't waste time. He jabbed a finger at a spot on the map, an isolated valley rimmed by peaks that scraped the cloud line. Recon found a group of refugees stuck in a landslide basin. 36 people, mostly families. No food, no clean water, no way out on foot. Mara studied the map, her mind already breaking it into crosswinds and fuel loads, ascent angles and downdraft corridors. What's the ceiling? She asked. Rourke's face tightened. 12,000, maybe more. You'll be flying blind through half of it. She exhaled slowly. The Hercules' engines hated high-altitude climbs. The older the bird got, the more it complained when asked to do the impossible. But impossible was where Mara lived now. Load me with high-altitude rations, extra flares, and Jenkins on thermal scope. Rourke hesitated. Langley, if you lose an engine up there, I won't. Her voice killed the conversation like a blade drawn across rope. Ramirez's quiet grin said it all. They all knew she'd fly it anyway. Drop of if you've ever had to be. Stronger than the odds. Within the hour, the Hercules lumbered down the makeshift runway, its old propellers spinning whirlwinds of mist and gravel. Mara sat braced against the seat, headset crackling in her ear, every dial burned into her mind. Ramirez worked the checklists behind her, his voice a steady drumbeat that kept panic at bay. Clouds swallowed them as they climbed. The world outside the windshield dissolved into white noise, turbulence rattling bolts that were older than some of the crew. Altitude at 9,000, Jenkins reported from the cargo deck, eyes glued to the flickering thermal scope. Signals faint, but they're clustered near the northern ridge. Mara adjusted the throttle, coaxing more power from engines that were already gasping in the thin air. You okay up there? Ramirez asked, his voice pitched just above the drone dot. She flexed her fingers on the yoke. Always. The first drop went wide gusts over the supply canisters off course, sending them skidding into the rocks 50 meters from the refugees. On the second pass, she pushed the nose down hard, fighting every instinct that screamed too low. Mark it. She called back, clear. Jenkins barked. Crates tumbled into the swirling snow, parachutes popping like fireworks in the thin air. Through a gap in the clouds, Mara caught sight of small figures scrambling toward them, arms waving wildly. It was enough, but the return leg wasn't. Halfway back through the pass, the port engine sputtered just once, a cough that made the Hercules buck like a wounded animal. Ramirez! She snapped. I see it. Fuel mixes off crossfeed valves aren't responding. Mara's mind spun. She could see the fix in her head, a manual bypass, splicing the fuel line with an emergency patch that should have been replaced months ago. But it would mean leaving the cockpit. Leaving control. Ramirez saw it too. He was already unstrapping. I've got it. You fly. She locked eyes with him for a heartbeat. Then she nodded. Hold her together. The Hercules rocked and groaned as Ramirez climbed into the maintenance hatch behind the bulkhead. The storm outside pounded the fuselage with sleet and wind that howled like a feral thing. Minutes dragged. Warnings blinked red and angry across the console. But Mara's hands never left the yoke. Hold, she whispered. Just hold. Finally, Ramirez's voice crackled through the headset. Try her now. She flicked the switch. The port engine stuttered, then caught. Its steady roar, a lifeline that pulled them back from the abyss. When they touched down, every bolt and seam in the Hercules felt like it was exhaling relief alongside the crew. Ramirez collapsed onto the cargo ramp, his coverall streaked with oil, laughing breathlessly. Mara climbed down last, boots meeting the concrete like a promise kept. Rourke was there, arms crossed, eyes brimming with a respect he no longer bothered to hide. You keep proving the odds wrong, Langley, he said. She gave him that same small smile. Someone has to. Above them, the battered Hercules loomed like an old guardian, its scars glinting in the pale dawn. Drop if you know some battles are won not by strength alone, but by never letting go. The compound's night was never silent. Even when the generators hummed low and the runway lights dimmed, there was always the soft hiss of hydraulics, the clink of tools, the low murmur of people who couldn't sleep. Mara Langley moved through, it all like a ghost wrapped in grease and adrenaline. After the mountain pass run, the Hercules sat like a weary prizefighter in the center of the hangar, a spiderweb of scaffolding encasing its battered frame. Engineers picked at its guts, welding new plates over old scars. Somewhere in the darkness, a wrench slipped, metal clanging to the concrete. No one cursed, no one spoke. Everyone knew how close they'd come this time. Mara didn't rest. Rest was for people who could trust the dawn to come without them holding the line. Instead, she stood at a folding table, blueprints spread under. A flickering work lamp, a black coffee growing cold by her elbow. She traced fuel lines with a fingertip, recalculating angles, rerouting redundancies only she and her father could have dreamed up. Ramirez dropped into a chair opposite her, fresh from a debrief that had taken hours too long. "You know you can't fix that bird with prayers and duct tape forever, right?" he asked. Mara's eyes didn't lift from the diagram. "That's exactly how we've done it so far." He huffed a tired laugh. "Rourke says the brass is coming down tomorrow. They want to see the ghost who's been pulling miracles out of a museum piece." Mara's lips twitched. "Let them look." He leaned back, studying her in the low light. "Does it ever get to you, the way they look at you now? Like you're some kind of myth?" She did look at him, then dark eyes clear, unreadable. "Let them believe in something. Better that than what's waiting if we fail." A voice crackled over the PA system. "Rourke's," he sounded older tonight, stretched thin. "Ops to Langley, report to the tower." Ramirez winced. "Should I come?" She closed the folder, tucking it under her arm. "Get some sleep. I'll handle it." Drop a "if you've ever stood alone because you had to." The tower windows glowed like eyes above the compound. Inside, the hum of radios layered over the static of distant weather reports. Rourke stood at the window, back rigid, shoulders squared as if he could keep the world from falling apart by will alone. He didn't turn when she stepped in. "They're stuck again." He jabbed a thumb at the storm maps pinned to the corkboard. Supply convoy washed out 30 clicks north. No bridge, no road. Mudslide took out the backup route. He faced her finally, eyes bloodshot. "And there. Not alone. We've got an intel package-friendly informants trapped with them. Locals helping us track insurgent smuggling lanes. If they get caught, they won't," Mara said. "Damn it, Langley." His voice cracked. "This isn't a simple drop. You'll have to land on a fire road barely wide enough for that wingspan. And if the soil's too soft, then we make it work," she said. Rourke's mouth twisted like he wanted to argue, but they both knew who they'd send. Who they always sent. "Brief your crew," he said, voice softer now. "You'll be wheels up at 0500. She didn't waste words. She just nodded and turned for the door. Outside, the wind whipped grit across her boots, the old hangar creaking in protest. She passed by the Hercules, its scarred fuselage catching the moonlight like old armor. She pressed her palm to the metal just for a heartbeat and let the cold seep into her skin. "Hold," she told it. Just one more dot by dawn. The crew stood assembled by the cargo ramp. Ramirez, Jenkins. Lasco, faces hollow with fatigue, but burning with the same fire she carried. She didn't give them a speech. She didn't have to. They knew what they were, what they had become together. They lifted off into a sky bruised purple and gold, the Hercules groaning as it climbed. Inside the cockpit, Mara felt every vibration through her boots, every tremor of the old bird's bones echoing in her chest. "Approach vector plotted," Ramirez said behind her. "Wind's picking up over the ridge." "Of course it is," Mara murmured. Her lips twitched at the edge. "Get ready for short field landing procedures. Lasco, double-check the cargo latch." We're not losing gear to a pothole. They dropped. Low, the terrain rising to meet them in green waves. Trees crowded the edges of the narrow dirt road that would be their only hope of setting down. A fire road, barely packed, muddy from the storm that hadn't quite given up yet. The radio crackled. "Langley, this is forward recon convoy's position confirmed. But we've got bogies moving in from the south. ETA 20 minutes. She keyed. Her mic, "Then we're in and out in 10. The Hercules dropped gear. Flaps down. Trees rushed past so close the wingtips seemed to brush the canopy. Trim 2 degrees left. Ramirez called out, voice tight. "Got it." The wheels hit dirt. The plane lurched, mud spraying in sheets as the old bird fought to keep its balance. Mara rode the brakes like she was breaking a wild horse, hands steady on the throttles. They skidded to a stop 100 feet from the Convoy 23. People huddled beside trucks half buried in muck. Doors open. "Go, go, go." She barked. Lasco and Jenkins leaped from the ramp, throwing open crates, rations, thermal blankets, ammunition. Mara's eyes never left the tree line. Any minute now gunfire cracked through the mist. "Contact." "South Ridge." Ramirez shouted. Mara's heart slammed into gear. "Load the informants first, everything else second." Bullets thudded into the Hercules' fuselage. The old bird took it with a groan, metal ringing like a church bell. Mara spun from the thumb. Cockpit, grabbed the edge of a crate to brace herself. Lasco dragged the first informant up the ramp, blood streaking his pant leg. Mara knelt, hands steady as she slapped on a tourniquet from the emergency kit clipped to her belt. Her mother's voice whispered in her head. Courage is steady hands when everything else shakes. More gunfire. Jenkins and Ramirez covered the ramp with sidearms, eyes wild but determined. "Last one. Last one." Lasco bellowed. Mara lunged for the cockpit, kicked the throttles forward before the cargo ramp was even up. The Hercules roared, mud spitting from the wheels as it clawed for speed. A bullet shattered the side window. Glass showered her shoulder. She didn't flinch. Come on, come on." Ramirez's voice begged behind her. They hit the end of the road. The Hercules lurched skyward, clearing the trees by a whisper. Below, muzzle flashes sputtered out like dying stars. "Drop up." If you've ever held the line when everyone else would have run. They broke through the clouds an hour later. The compound's runway stretching below them like salvation. They landed rough, tires screeching, the battered nose wheel threatening to fold, but holding just barely as the engines whined to a stop. Mara sat in the cockpit, glass shards glittering on her lap, blood smeared across her gloves that wasn't hers. She let her breath out in a single shudder, then stood at the ramp. The crew waited. Ramirez met her eyes, disbelief and admiration tangled in his grin. "You know they're gonna write songs about you, right?" he said. She just looked back at the Hercules behind them, old, pockmarked, beautiful in its defiance. "Let them," she murmured, "but they better get the plane right too." She stepped off the ramp into the rising dawn, the compound buzzing awake around her. Somewhere ahead, another storm waited. And so did she. Drop a, if you know that sometimes, just showing up makes you unstoppable. The wind off the tarmac smelled like rain and diesel, a sharp reminder that the world beyond the compound walls never really slept. Neither did Mara Langley. She leaned against the Hercules' battered landing gear, arms crossed over her chest, watching the storm roll in from the east like a wave of bruised ink. Lightning flickered across the distant hills, too far to hear yet, but close enough to feel in her bones. Around her, the crew moved like ghosts, Ramirez and Jenkins arguing over a faulty winch cable, Lasco rolling a fresh tire across the puddled concrete. Each man carried the same exhausted tension that Mara did, a coil of adrenaline that never quite unwound. Word had spread about the fire road rescue. The compound buzzed with rumors, now half legend, half warning. Some said Mara was lucky. Others said she was touched by something more than skill, a hunger for the impossible. She ignored them. Let them believe what they needed to. She knew the truth. The old bird survived because she asked it to. Because they asked each other to hold just. One more time. The rain hit at midnight, hammering the corrugated roof of the hangar like a firing squad. Mara sat cross-legged on the floor beside an open crate of spare parts, headlamp strapped to her forehead, fingers working a fuel pump valve so delicate that even the mechanics had stepped back to watch. Ramirez dropped to a knee beside her, water dripping from his soaked flight jacket. "Langley, Ops wants a word." She didn't look up. "Tell them I'm busy." They said now. She tightened the last bolt, wiped her hands on her thigh, and handed the pump to the wide-eyed mechanic hovering behind her. "Pressure tested twice before it goes back in. Twice." The ops room was lit like an interrogation chamber. Maps pinned across every wall, satellite photos strung together with tape and desperation. Major Rourke hunched over a tablet, lines of data reflecting in his tired eyes. He didn't look up as Mara stepped in. "You've read the reports on the dam, right?" She nodded. Of course she had. She read everything. She memorized everything. Landslide. Upstream from the dam wall. Debris buildups about to break the overflow. If it gives, it'll take 3 villages with it. Civilian evacuation's a mess. They're sending trucks, but the only way to move the sick and the old is airlift. Rourke dragged a finger along the satellite image, murky water pooling behind a cracked wall. "We've got 2 Black Hawks. They're already running round trips, but it's not enough. They need heavy lift for supplies and generator units. The only thing big enough is us," Mara said. He finally looked at her then, something like a plea hidden behind the command in his voice. "It's a gamble. The dam could go any minute." She rolled her shoulders, the fatigue falling from them like water. "Prep the bird. Drop if you've ever stepped into the storm when it was the only way out. The rain didn't stop. It thickened, turned to sleet that sliced sideways through the floodlights as the Hercules taxied to the far end of the runway." Mara sat strapped into the cockpit, her hands on the yoke like they were carved there. Ramirez ran final checks behind her, his voice calm even as the wind rocked the fuselage. "Cargo locked. Generators secure. Last evac passengers loaded." Mara keyed her mic. "Tower, Hercules 09er ready for departure." Static crackled, then the controller's voice broke through. "Godspeed, Langley." She pushed the throttles forward. The old engines howled, wheels chewing through puddles that sprayed like rooster tails. The compound fell away behind them, a patch of flickering lights swallowed by the storm. They climbed hard, wings flexing under the weight. Lightning danced across the windshield in fleeting bursts of blue and white. Jenkins's voice came from the hold. "We've got eyes on the dam. It's holding for now." "For now," Ramirez echoed under his breath. Mara ignored the tremor in her gut. She banked the Hercules east, nose dipping as they aligned with the makeshift landing zone, a gravel plateau above the river, carved out by volunteers with bulldozers in desperation. The radio squawked. "Hercules 09er, this is site lead. Wind shear's brutal. If you can't set down, wave off." Mara keyed the mic, eyes steady. "No. Wave off. We land." She feathered the flaps, throttled back. The plateau lurched closer through the sleet. Crosswinds battered the old bird so hard the hull rattled like a drum. Ramirez's knuckles whitened on the console. "Easy, easy." The wheels slammed down, the Hercules skidding across the gravel. Mara rode the brakes with that uncanny calm. Throttles feathered so precisely, it felt like she was willing the plane to stop. They did barely just feet from the drop-off, where the river churned below. "Ground crew moving." Jenkins called from the back. "Generators coming off now. Passengers on standby." Mara sat back, chest heaving once. The adrenaline buzzed through her like a live wire, but her eyes were clear. She watched the crews offload crates of emergency equipment, makeshift pumps, fuel drums. Rations that might keep the valley alive long enough to evacuate. A rumble shook the ground beneath them. Mara felt it in her boots before she heard the groan a low, bone-deep roar as the cracked dam wall buckled under the strain. "Langley!" Ramirez shouted. "We've got to move now." She didn't need telling. Lock it down. Everyone strapped in. The Hercules was rolling before the last cargo straps clanged shut. Water thundered past the plateau, swallowing trees and shacks like matchsticks. "Come on. Come on." Ramirez's voice was raw with disbelief. The plane hit the end of the strip just as the river surged over its banks. The wheels lifted free, the Hercules clawing at the sky with every ounce of stubborn life it had left. Mara's eyes flicked to the mirror. Muddy water churning over the road they'd just left behind. They climbed in silence for a long moment. The roar of the engines, the only sound that mattered. Drapa, if you know the difference between impossible and inevitable, is just not giving up. When they landed back at Deckhaven, the dawn was breaking through the last shred of the storm. The refugees stumbled off the cargo ramp, wrapped in blankets, faces pale with shock and relief. Mara stood at the foot of the ramp, eyes on the Hercules's battered wing. She reached out, ran a hand along the dented metal, her palm warm against the cold. Ramirez stood beside her, shoulders slumped but his grin defiant. "One more?" he asked. Mara's smile was a tired, stubborn thing. "One more." Behind them, the compound stirred awake again, hammers ringing on steel, engines rumbling back to life. There would always be one more storm, one more impossible mission, and they would be ready. Drapa, if you know the only thing stronger than the storm is the one who flies through it. The rain didn't so much stop as it paused, the sky over Deckhaven compound hanging heavy and gray. Mara Langley could feel it in her bones, another storm waiting just beyond the horizon. She leaned against the Hercules's flank, boots planted. In a growing puddle, eyes tracking the rivulets of water that traced paths through the grime and battle scars on the old bird's belly. Mechanics crawled over her like ants on a wounded giant. Panels open, wires exposed. The reek of jet fuel and burned oil mixed with the metallic bite of fresh welding. Somewhere up by the nose gear, Jenkins and Lasco were laughing too loud, the kind of laugh that only comes when you know you should be sleeping. Ramirez appeared at Mara's side, a clipboard tucked under his arm. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his flight suit half zipped against the sticky dawn heat. "You seen the roster?" he asked, voice low. Mara didn't look at him. "I've seen it. They're asking for a coastal run. Supply and recon, the usual spots plus 3 new ones. Half of them aren't even mapped properly." Mara ran a thumb along a line of fresh rivets, feeling the way the metal hummed under her touch. "Then we'll map them." Ramirez huffed. "You ever think about saying no?" She finally looked at him, one eyebrow raised. "You ever think about asking someone else?" He snorted, handing over the clipboard. "Fair point. Drop it if you've ever shouldered it, because no one else could dot in ops." Rourke stood over a table littered with coffee mugs, half-eaten ration bars, and a single battered laptop. Satellite images were pinned to the wall with duct tape tiny. Fish-in villages hugging the ragged coastline, their roofs nothing more than specks of color against the hungry blue sea. He didn't bother with greetings. Tides ripped up most of the docks. "We'll have to drop food and medical kits onto rooftops. Some of these villages haven't had contact in days, no radio, no flares." Mara flipped through the manifests, her finger tracing flight paths already forming in her head. "How's the wind sheer off the bay?" Rourke scrubbed a hand across his stubble. "Rough. You'll have about 15 minutes over each drop zone before the next squall rolls in. If you miss the window, then we come back around." Mara finished for him. He sighed, defeated and grateful all at once. "Be wheels up at 0600, and Langley," she looked up. He met her eyes with something like awe. "Just come back." She didn't smile. She just nodded. That was promise enough. The crew loaded the Hercules under the flickering hangar lights pallets of rice, bottled water, med kits, blankets wrapped in weatherproof tarps. Mara moved among them like a conductor, eyes darting from straps to tie-downs to hydraulic locks. She trusted the old bird with her life, but she didn't trust Chance. Ramirez leaned on the cargo ramp, watching her. "One of these days, you're gonna teach me how you know what she needs before she does." Mara glanced up, smirked faintly. "You've been listening." "That's a start." When they lifted off, the sun was just a smear of gold behind roiling clouds. The sea below looked calm in that lying way water does, masking the currents that could snap a boat in half without warning. Jenkins manned the drop release, fingers drumming on the steel railings. Lasco sat beside him, eyes flicking from the altimeter to the coastline unfolding beneath them. "First drop in 3 minutes," Ramirez called out. "Wind's gonna shove us north if we don't compensate." Mara adjusted the trim, thumb brushing the throttles like a lover's spine. "We'll hold." The first village appeared like a handful of matchboxes on a spit of sand. Through the cockpit glass, Mara saw the tiny figures waving tarps, trying to flag down salvation. "Doors open." She barked. Jenkins and Lasco wrestled. The first pallet into position. Mara banked the Hercules into the wind, her knuckles pale against the yoke. "Mark it." "Clear." The crate tumbled into the air, parachute billowing like a ghost. It hit dead center on a flat roof, the people below rushing to anchor it before the wind claimed it for the C.1 down. 10 to go. The next village was harder. Wind. Shear slammed the Hercules sideways, rattling loose bolts and making the engines groan. Mara held the line, eyes locked on the horizon as Jenkins shouted over the headset. "Crate stuck. We're losing time. Fix it." She snapped back. Lasco kicked the pallet free just as the Hercules dipped low enough to clip the tops of stilt. Houses. The drop landed shallow, still close enough to save the day. Barely. They hit the last drop just as the first squall tore across the bay. Rain pounded the fuselage like hail, visibility collapsing into a blur of gray. Ramirez leaned forward, voice calm but tight. "Langley, we've got enough fuel to make it back on a straight line. No sightseeing." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The old bird knew her mind. Knew she'd fly them home on fumes if that's what it took. Drop a "if you've ever trusted your gut" when the rest said stop. When Deckhaven's runway lights broke through the clouds, the Hercules dipped one last time, the battered wings flexing like they were exhaling relief. They touched down rough, water sheeting off. The tires, engines coughing as Mara taxied to the hangar. On the tarmac, ground crews ran for cover, but Mara stayed in her seat for a long heartbeat, eyes on the rain hammering the windshield. She rested a hand on the yoke, thumb brushing a nicked edge worn smooth by her grip. Ramirez unbuckled beside her. "One." "More run?" Mara turned to him, tired but unbroken. "One more." They stepped out into the storm together. Overhead, thunder rolled like distant drums. Somewhere beyond the compound's wire fence, people waited, huddled in the dark, counting on an old aircraft and the pilot who refused to leave them behind. And Mara Langley would be ready. Drop a "if you know that sometimes you're the only thing standing between the storm and everyone who can't fly." Deckhaven's nights were never truly dark. Even when the generators sputtered and the floodlights flickered low, the compound pulsed with a kind of restless glow, flashlights bobbing between stacks of crates, sparks drifting down from welders, patching up battered hulls. The storm had receded for now, but its echo lingered in the damp wind that prowled between the hangars. Mara Langley stood alone by the Hercules' wing, her silhouette framed by the massive tail fin that rose like a battered monument to everything she'd done and everything she was still willing to do. She rested one hand on the cold metal, feeling the shiver of tension that always hummed through her bones before a mission. Ramirez's voice broke the quiet. "Couldn't sleep?" She didn't look at him, didn't try. He stepped up beside her, stuffing his hands into his jacket pockets. The glow from the work lamps cut harsh lines across his face, making the exhaustion in his eyes look older than it was. "Rook's got another one for you." Mara's lips twitched. "Of course he does. Not the usual run. Bigger. He wants you in ops." She nodded once, but didn't move. Her fingers traced a line of rivets along the Hercules's wing root, tiny imperfections she knew by heart. Each dent and patch a testament to every fight they'd survived together. "You think she's got one more?" Ramirez asked softly. Mara didn't answer with words. She just laid her palm flat against the skin of the old bird and whispered under her breath, "Hold for me. Drop us. You've ever asked the impossible of yourself and answered." Anyway, the ops room was hotter than usual, the whir of portable fans battling the humidity that dripped from the ceiling pipes. Rourke leaned over a table littered with unfolded maps, red grease pencil circles marking points along a winding river delta. Flood levels spiked overnight, he said as Mara stepped in. Village clusters along the banks are underwater. Radio spotty. They're building rafts out of fishing nets and tin sheeting. It's a damn patchwork. If the levee north of the bend gives, they'll be swept out to sea. Mara scanned the map, reading the landscape like a surgeon reads an X-ray. How many? 200, maybe more. Mixed families, elderly kids. A convoy can't get their roads. Are gone. No landing strip. No dry ground bigger than a tennis court. She traced a line with her finger. "We'll hover drop rafts and rations." "Flare markers?" Rourke shook his head. "No markers. Night run. They'll burn lanterns if they have fuel." "Then we look for shadows," Mara said, voice soft but immovable. Ramirez watched her from the corner, his expression half proud, half worried. "Storm cell moving back in. Wind shear off the delta is brutal." Rourke rubbed the back of his neck. "If you don't want this one," Mara cut him off with a glance, "you'd send me anyway." He didn't argue. He didn't have to dot by midnight. The Hercules sat at the end of the runway like an old warhorse at the gate engines idling. Cargo bay packed with inflatable rafts, survival rations, bundles of thermal blankets. Lasco and Jenkins checked tie-downs. Their voices hushed as if the plane might overhear and change its mind. Ramirez climbed into the cockpit last, dropping into the co-pilot's seat with a grunt. "Flare guns ready, but they'll only help if we're practically on top of them." Mara adjusted her harness, flicking switches in sequence. "We'll be on top of them." The Hercules thundered down the runway, its wheels leaving the ground. Like an old man standing after a long sit, slow, grudging, but unstoppable. Mara guided them into the clouds, the compound lights swallowed behind them. They found the first cluster by sheer instinct. A single lantern flickering on a roof that barely cleared the floodwater. Mara held the Hercules steady against gusts that slapped at the wings like giant hands trying to swat them from the sky. "Doors open." She called over the headset. Lasco and Jenkins worked the release rig, muscle and sweat holding chaos at bay. A raft hit the water dead center, its dull orange canopy blooming like a promise. "Next group's downriver," Ramirez said, voice tight as he fought to keep the grid coordinates updated through the static. Mara dipped the nose, skimming so low that the Hercules's reflection danced across the black water in broken shards of moonlight. She felt the tremor in the port engine but ignored it, talked to the old bird under her breath. "Just hold for me." The second drop took 3 passes. Crosswinds grabbed at the raft, spinning it like a leaf. Jenkins cursed it into the mic. Lasco braced his boots on the deck, timing the release like a sniper's trigger pull. The raft hit water, bobbing toward a cluster of people waving rags and flashlights. "Ramirez, how many left?" He checked the manifest, rain dripping from his hair onto the tablet balanced on his knee. 6 more groups, storms closing the window fast. Mara didn't flinch. She banked the Hercules again, engines straining. The wind screamed through the open cargo door. She tasted metal in her mouth, blood from biting down on the edge of her cheek to stay sharp. One by one, They found them lantern glows half buried by mist, desperate hands reaching from rooftops and rafts. Each pass shaved another layer from the Hercules' battered heart, but the bird held. They both did dot by the final drop. The rain was sideways, the fuselage rattling so hard it felt like it might come apart at the seams. Jenkins slammed the bay door shut, his face pale as he strapped into the bulkhead. "Langley, fuel's near reserve." Ramirez barked. "If we don't punch it now, hold," Mara said, her voice a whisper through the roar. She felt the Hercules like a pulse in her chest. Just a little more. The last raft tumbled out into the dark, bobbing like a stubborn ember refusing to drown. Mara locked her jaw, nose up, throttles wide. The Hercules climbed through the black until the water below was only a memory. Drop a, if you know that. Sometimes the only way out is through. They limped back to Deckhaven just before dawn. Engines coughing, the undercarriage streaked with salt and mud. Mara taxied to a stop at the edge of the hangar, fingers trembling as they flicked the final switches. Ramirez unbuckled first, leaning back with a ragged laugh. "One day," he said, voice hoarse. "One day, I'm gonna say no when you ask. For another run." Mara rested her forehead against the yoke, eyes closed. Not today. She climbed down the ladder into a drizzle that felt gentle compared to the storm they'd outrun. Ground crews surrounded the Hercules, eyes wide at the fresh dents and scrapes that had joined the old scars. Rourke met her halfway across the tarmac, hands shoved deep in his jacket. He didn't ask for a report. He just looked at her, at the crew behind her, at the old bird that had defied the sea yet again. "You keep proving me wrong," he said quietly. Mara brushed rain from her eyes. "I'm not here to be right. I'm here to fly." And as the sun clawed its way over the compound walls, Deckhaven woke up to another day that shouldn't have been possible, and to the woman and her ancient aircraft that made sure it was. Drop a, if you know that sometimes. Your wings are the only thing holding the sky together. Rain drummed against the hangar roof like a steady heartbeat as Mara Langley sat cross-legged beneath the Hercules' starboard wing. The old bird loomed above her, wings stretched wide like a battered guardian. Even grounded, it felt alive, its frame still humming with the memory of the last impossible flight. Ramirez found her there, grease on her sleeves, blueprints unrolled beside an open toolbox. He crouched, peering at her with eyes red from too many sleepless nights. "You know, they're saying the brass wants to retire her, right?" Mara didn't look up. She ran her finger along a diagram of the hydraulic system, tracing a bypass she'd planned to keep the port flaps from seizing again. "They say a lot of things." Ramirez sat back on his heels. "Langley, she's got cracks in her wings that tape can't fix. We barely made it back last time." Mara's mouth twitched. "We always barely make it back, and then we go again." He huffed a dry laugh. "You really think you can outrun a graveyard with duct tape and sheer will?" She finally looked at him, eyes dark and unwavering. "I don't outrun anything, Ramirez. I fly through it." Before he could answer, Lasco's voice echoed from the hangar doors. "Captain, Ops wants you now." Ramirez stood first, offering a hand to pull her up. "One more? One more. Drop a, if you've ever said yes when every bone begged you to say no." The ops room was hot and close, screens flickering with weather maps and satellite feeds. Major Rourke stood over a table strewn with soggy printouts, a frown buried in the lines on his forehead. He didn't waste time. "Recon says the North Ridge took a direct hit, mudslides everywhere. There's an entire medical camp stranded on an old mining plateau. They lost radio. Half the tents are gone. And we've got a new storm cell spinning up." He pointed at the cluster of white dots on the satellite image. "You're the only lift asset with the range to get them supplies before the road crews dig out the pass." Mara read the terrain, mountains rising like broken teeth, snowmelt rivers swollen and angry. She didn't blink. "Payload?" Rourke slid a manifest across the table. Food, blankets, trauma kits, field generators. If you can drop it on the high ground, they'll hold until ground teams punch through. She tucked the manifest under her arm. She'll make it. Rourke's eyes flickered to Ramirez. If she doesn't, she will, Mara said. Flat as stone. By dawn, the Hercules' cargo bay was a fortress of crates and strapped-down generators. Lasco walked the rigging twice, boots thudding on the metal deck. Jenkins tested the release winch, one hand steadying himself on a bulkhead that still bore the scars from last month's rescue. Ramirez settled into the co-pilot's seat as Mara ran her fingers over the yoke. It's just one more, he said, voice trying for casual. She keyed her headset, ignoring the tremor in the starboard engine gauge. It always is. The Hercules rolled down the strip like an old bull waking up, wheels hissing on rain slick concrete before lifting into the clouds. The sky was a bruise, wind gusting against the fuselage hard enough that rivets creaked. Approach vector in place, Ramirez called out, eyes darting from the scope to Mara's calm profile. When's? At 60. Updraft's worse near the ridge. Mara flexed her gloved hands, nudging the throttles. She hold. Drop a if you've ever bet everything on the thing no one else believed in. The mountain rose ahead, a sheer wall of rock and mist. The mining plateau, a bare patch of earth, clinging to the slope like an afterthought. Through a break in the clouds, Mara spotted the flapping remnants of medical tents, tiny figures waving tarps like signal flags. Doors open. She barked. Jenkins and Lasco braced the pallets. The Hercules lurched sideways in the crosswind, rattling the drop rig. So hard the cables whined. Hold her steady. Jenkins shouted. Mara locked her jaw, adjusting pitch by degrees so small they were more instinct than math. The first crate tumbled out, then the second, each parachute blossoming into the storm like a stubborn promise. Direct hit. Lasco whooped, but it was drowned by the sudden jolt that rocked the entire airframe. Engines losing pressure, Ramirez shouted. Starboard twos throwing sparks. Mara's eyes never left the horizon. We're not done. Secure the bay. The Hercules groaned, metal vibrating under her palms like a trapped animal. She coaxed it higher, searching for a break in the wind to swing back for the final run. Below, the plateau vanished under a curtain of sleet. Mara tilted the yoke, voice calm even as alarm screamed. Mark it. Clear. Jenkins yelled. The last crate dropped, vanishing into the white. Mara didn't wait for confirmation. She throttled hard, fighting the failing engine's pull, eyes scanning for an escape route through the pass. They punched through the clouds low, skimming treetops that clawed at the wings. Ramirez's knuckles were white on the console. We've got to shut it down or it'll take the other with it. Do it. He cut the fuel line, the starboard prop slowing to a windmill spin. The Hercules wobbled, dipped and leveled as Mara fed every ounce of power to the remaining engines. They cleared the ridge by a handful of meters. The storm howled behind them, the plateau swallowed by fog and distance. Drop a if you've ever carried something broken over the finish line. When the runway lights at Deckhaven blinked through the mist, Mara let out a single breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The wheels slammed down rough, the left side fighting to balance the dead weight on the right. They rolled to a stop just shy of the hangar. Steam rising from the overheated brakes, Ramirez slumped back. Sweat and rain slicked in his hair. You're going to kill us one day. Mara's smile was just a shadow. Not today. She stepped down into the storm, boots sinking into the mud puddle that pooled beneath the wing. Mechanics scrambled forward, already arguing about what it would take to bring the starboard engine back to life. Rourke met her halfway across the pad, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. They'll call you reckless again. They'll say you're tempting fate. She wiped rain from her brow, glancing over her shoulder at the Hercules battered, burned, and still standing. Maybe I am, she said, but the storm calls first. And she'd always answer, Drapa, if you know there's no such thing as giving up, when you're the one who flies through the storm. The dawn broke slow and uncertain over Deckhaven. The compound was quiet in that hushed way that only came after a storm, when the ground was still soaked and the sky too tired to threaten rain again yet. Mara Langley sat alone in the cockpit of the Hercules. She hadn't even unbuckled since the last run. Her flight suit was still wet at the knees. Grit ground into the fabric where she'd knelt on the cargo ramp to tie down a shifting crate mid-flight. The engines were cold now, the entire airframe. Resting like an exhausted animal, metal ticking and groaning as it cooled. She pressed her palm against the throttle quadrant, feeling the old bird's heartbeat still thrumming under her own skin. Outside, crew trucks rumbled by, puddles splashing against the Hercules' battered tires. Somewhere, a wrench slipped and clattered to the concrete, a normal sound, oddly comforting. Ramirez appeared at the base of the ladder, arms crossed, a fresh bandage peeking out from under his sleeve. He didn't climb up. He just looked at her through the glass, that half smile that said he'd follow her into hell if she asked. Because she always did. Rourke's boots echoed up the stairs. Behind him, the major stopped beside Ramirez, squinting into the cockpit. You going to sit there all day? He called up. Mara's voice crackled over the cum that she'd left open out of habit. Depends. You got something for me? Rourke gave her that look that always came before he handed her an impossible choice. You know they want to ground her. Official word from the brass is she's done. Mara's fingers traced the edge of the throttle. So they're sending you to talk me down. Rourke barked a laugh that wasn't really a laugh. Langley, you think I'd waste my breath? But they did send word one last run, if you're up for it. Nobody else will touch it. Ramirez sighed, of course. Rourke flipped open. Weathered folder. Maps. Grainy photos of a bridge half submerged by floodwater. A convoy pinned at the river's edge. 25 people. Medical staff, local volunteers. A few families they pulled out before the flood made the roads disappear. No lift assets left, no boats. The only way out is by air. Mara looked past him, through the rain-spattered glass at the Hercules' wings, at the dark streaks where the rivets barely held. How bad is it? She asked. Rourke didn't sugarcoat. Worse than usual. One landing zone, no strip. You'll need to hover low enough to pull them straight out. Storm cells moving back in. They're saying it's the last one for the season. If they're wrong, there's no tomorrow for that convoy. She didn't nod. Didn't speak. She just ran her thumb along the throttles one more time, then unbuckled. The cockpit door creaked. Open, the stale air giving way to a gust of dawn wind. She climbed down. Ramirez stepped aside, but not before murmuring, one more. One more. Drapa, if you've ever known you'd say yes before they even asked. The prep took hours, but it felt like minutes. The mechanics argued over the port engine again. Lasco rethreaded the winch cable twice. Jenkins triple-checked the fuel. Cross-feed. Every man and woman who touched the Hercules did so like they were laying hands on a relic and a lifeline all at once. The brass didn't come to watch. They didn't have to. They knew she'd go. Mara kept her eyes on the bird, every dent and patch a story, every rivet a promise dot when they lifted off. The sky was pale and heavy, the sun a thin smear behind roiling clouds. The cockpit smelled of fuel, sweat, and that faint ozone tang that always came before the rain. Ramirez's voice crackled through the headset. Wind shear's picking up. If we have to wave off, we won't. He didn't argue. He never did. They found the convoy pinned on a muddy slope, the river licking at the trucks like a hungry animal. Figures huddled under tarps, waving. Bright cloth scraps and a last-ditch signal to the sky. Visual, Mara said. She dropped the Hercules lower, then was sane. Engines whining as they fought the turbulence that battered the fuselage. Doors open. Lasco barked from the cargo deck. Jenkins clipped into his harness, checking the winch line with gloved hands. Ready on lift. Mara's hands were stone on the yoke, her breath locked behind her teeth as the Hercules held steady just meters above the tree line. The river's roar reached up through the open ramp, a steady hiss that threatened to drown out every command. The first man on the line was an older medic, his face streaked with mud. Jenkins hauled him in with Lasco bracing the cable. Next! Gunfire. Somewhere off the far bank, a scattering of small arms fire, popping like distant firecrackers. Ramirez's eyes went wide. Langley hostiles? Mara didn't blink. Hold the line. Drop if you've ever been the shield for people who had nothing else. 2 more bodies, then 3. Each one yanked from the mud as the Hercules trembled under the strain. Bullets chewed into the tail fin, sparks skittering along the cargo ramp. Just one more. Jenkins yelled, his voice raw. Ramirez leaned over the console, hands trembling. Engines throwing pressure warnings. Hold! The last woman came up on the line, a child clinging to her side. She tumbled into Jenkins's arms, eyes wide. With a kind of disbelief that made Mara's chest ache, winch in, the ramp slammed shut. Mara throttled forward, the Hercules lurching against the wind shear as bullets sparked along the belly. The river fell away below them, the convoy shrinking to shadows in the churn. Ramirez sagged into his seat, chest heaving. Langley, you're going to kill us one day. Mara didn't look at him. She just whispered to the old bird, not today. They cleared the storm cell by inches. Decavan's runway lights blinked through the rain, and Mara brought the Hercules in low and hard. The wheels hit tarmac rough, the engines coughing but catching one last time. When they rolled to a stop, the storm broke behind them, the last squall dying like a promise kept. She sat in the cockpit alone for a long moment. Her reflection ghosted in the glass grease smudged, hair plastered to her forehead, eyes so clear it almost hurt to look at them. Ramirez came up the ladder, eyes bright with something like reverence and resignation. He didn't say anything. He just held out a hand. One more? He asked. Mara reached out, her palm rough and warm. One more. Outside, Decavan bustled medics tending the rescued ground crews moving around the Hercules with quiet care. Someone no one ever knew who started clapping. It spread until the hangar thundered with it, a roar that drowned out the rain. She didn't stay to hear it. She just stepped down the ramp, boots hitting the concrete steady and sure. Before she disappeared into the crowd, she looked back at the old bird one last time. The Hercules ancient, pockmarked, half-holy stood under the lights like the ghost of every storm they'd ever flown through. And in that moment, Mara Langley knew what she was. Not the storm, but the one who carried everyone through it. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. Somewhere another squall would form. Another mission would call. And she'd be there, hands on the throttles, eyes on the horizon, heart beating in time with an aircraft that would never, ever stop proving them all wrong. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.